My name is Philip Ryken. I serve as the 8th president of Wheaton College. I teach and preach the Bible, and I try to get into the biblical languages to make sure I understand what the Bible is actually saying.
Dr. Philip Ryken, good to see you. Welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
Well, thank you, David, and it's always just fun to talk about a Bible passage. And
It is, to go into this kind of depth, right?
Right.
You can't do this in every sermon.
No, well, maybe you can in every sermon, but you can't do it all the way through the sermon. You just do not have time for all the things that can be said. That's true.
That can and probably ought to be said on that. Now, when you were studying Greek back in college, what was the biggest challenge you faced?
Yeah, so good question. I started Greek here at Wheaton. Then I studied both Greek and Hebrew at Westminster Theological Seminary. I'm not a star language student. It's not a weedy struggle. It's like if I really put the time in, I can get it. I'll just say one thing about it is difficult. I mean, just the amount of memorization you have to do. A lot of us don't know English as well as we ought to. And if we really knew English grammar, we would have some advantages, I think, when we turn to grammar in its other forms. The main thing I would say is I've always felt that if you're studying the biblical languages, they need your absolute maximum effort every day in your studies. The memorization, the declensions, the grammar, all the knowledge builds on itself. So, and part of my thinking too was that, by the time I got to seminary, I did not imagine that I would be a Bible scholar. I was anticipating being in preaching ministry. And what I wanted to retain enough of the biblical languages so that I could continue to use them as part of my sermon preparation. And I really felt, I think rightly, that the more I invested in that during my seminary, it would bear long-term dividends.
And when you come back to it, you can begin to remember you don't remember all of the different possibilities necessarily, but you remember the whole.
Yeah,
and
I think that's right.
You can deal with it.
For sure, you have a feel for
Yes.
syntax, a feel for the language, what it does and doesn't do, what kinds of possibilities it holds. And I think you learn, if you make that investment, you learn the difference between really good and not so good exegetical arguments. So it's not so much that you're going to necessarily come up with some amazing new idea or insight on your own, but you'll have a good sense of like, okay, this makes very good sense from a commentary. And having the biblical languages helps with that.
And I think it helps you on the other end to communicate that as well. It can.
Right.
It
Yeah.
can get in the way.
Yep. Or you can overread things,
Yes.
right? Which
Yeah.
is a danger that you're warned about in the seminary.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17, 18, and 19. This was some of Paul's later letters to those that he had brought along into faith and he had mentored.
Yeah, I mean, specifically in this instance, he's writing to Timothy, although it's clear it's meant to be read out loud to the church in Ephesus. So it's like a phone call when you know other people in the room are listening, so you're orienting your words a bit to the rest of the audience. I think Paul does that here in his instructions for Timothy.
So he knows somebody other than Timothy is
Well-
going to be reading and consuming this letter.
For sure, including in the verses we're looking at, David, 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19, you'll see from the very first words, somebody clearly is in mind. As for the rich in this present age, Paul says, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. If you're a wealthy person, as so many of us listening to this podcast will be in world terms, these are very important instructions for us. It's encouraging to know, hey, there are rich people in the family of God. It's expected and understood that in a church like Ephesus, a
It wasn't
major
just
city,
all poverty
no,
and slaves.
Some of these people have material wealth, and it's really important for us to exercise good stewardship of what we have. What I wanted to point out, just from a biblical languages perspective, is the repetition of various forms of the Greek vocabulary word for rich, plousios. It's used here as an adjective, as a noun, as an adverb, as a verb. The apostle is playing a bit with the possibilities to draw out meanings, connections, and maybe a few ironies in the interest of making a very strong point of practical application. So he's writing to rich people. He calls them rich, just right there at the beginning. He also says, though, that riches are uncertain. So he's echoing a lot of things that are said in the Bible, Ecclesiastes and other places, like you don't know. It could be here today and gone tomorrow. That's the way wealth is. But notice this turn of phrase. God richly provides us with everything to enjoy. So it's pointing to the abundance of God. It's opening up a bigger perspective on what truly is rich. It's not just a matter of material possessions and wealth. No, God, there's a largesse in the character of God, and it's not limited to material things, although that's part of the context here. And it's just reminding you, if you're wealthy, there's a reason you're wealthy. It's because God is so generous with his wealth, and he's been generous specifically with you. And then when you get to verse 18, now here's a turn of phrase that really has a point to it. Okay, what about these rich people? What should they be doing? They should be rich. Okay, that seems a bit redundant. Like, okay, you are rich and you're supposed to be rich. Rich in what respect? In good works.
Yeah.
So there's a turn there. He wants those who have received these generous gifts from God to offer generous gifts to others. And I think the repetition of different forms for the same word just makes the connection really clear. Paul had a wealth of verbal resources at his disposal. He was an expert in rhetoric. He could have figured out a way to vary his vocabulary. And by the way, some English translations do this. They don't have rich in all four of those instances. NIV doesn't. It varies at a certain point. English Standard Version really highlights that. But I think a lot of us like to use varied vocabulary when we can. But Paul had a reason for wanting to just make that connection here, and it drives the point home, I think, in a really strong way.
Yeah, that's terrific. I've never noticed that in that passage before, having read it many, many times. I'm sure I probably read it in the Greek at one point, but to see that plousios, all it keeps coming back, rich. And as you were speaking, I kept thinking about God is the one who is so generous. And when the rich are generous, they are, in a way, imitating God.
Yeah, great point. This is a way to be God-like, Christ-like in how we exercise our stewardship. One thing I really like about this, there's very strong exhortation here. And particularly if you think about this read in a public setting, people of different economic circumstances.
All sitting around the room.
Yeah, there are people in that room that are much less well off, and they know who the wealthy people are. There are all kinds of cultural signals for that. And here these wealthy people are, they're in the church, and they're getting an instruction to be generous with what they give. And so everybody knows the instruction that they've been given. But Paul does it in a way that does not shame them, that does not make them feel guilty for having these gifts. No, it's a gift from God, but now use it richly. So I think it's a strong exhortation that's very lovingly delivered in a way people could actually receive and then put into practice. And I think Paul served the rich people well at the church at Ephesus, and really everyone who's been rich in the history of the church ever since, by giving this exhortation the way that he gave it.
Well, you and I both know people like that who are rich in this present age and yet are extremely generous.
It's a beautiful thing.
It is a great thing. Dr. Philip Ryken, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking. Dr. Phil Ryken is always a good friend of this podcast. I think this is about his 7th appearance in the last 5 years or so. So grateful for his support of this podcast and what we've been doing. I had never seen this sort of repetition in 1 Timothy 6 of rich and to be made rich and richly. And the repetition is just an amazing part. And, you know, it takes a preacher sometimes to recognize those things. So grateful for his help. Listen, if you're interested in contacting us here at the podcast, please do so by emailing us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Come see us at Wheaton College. It's a beautiful place, wonderful faculty, and get started today in studying for yourself biblical languages. Until next time, thanks for listening.